Welcome back. It's now time for the last two steps. We are going to cut open your bust and scoop out the inside bits to thin it out and to increase the surface area. Then we're going to put it back together and add finishing touches. This is a pretty messy step, so if you're working at home, you're really going to want to set up some garbage bags on the ground underneath where you're working so you can kind of pick up and wrap up your clay without getting too much dust all over. Have some fun and really try to make this unique and interesting and one of a kind, a piece that truly represents who you are as a person, how you view the world, or just make something you think looks pretty cool. That's okay too. Have some fun, my friends. Our next step in this process is to clean out the inside of our piece. For that, I'm going to wear a plastic coverall, and I'm going to have a big loop tool and a small loop tool and a needle tool. This is a messy step. If you're doing this at home and you don't have a plastic coverall, you're going to want to get like a large plastic bag and put it over your lap, and probably one on the floor as well to catch some of that clay. You're going to bring over your bust, and you are going to flip the bust upside down onto your lap. When you flip that bust upside down, I always start with the face towards me. I pick it up and then I flip it so the face is away from me, so I don't have the face pressing up against my stomach, which might mush that face. So there she is, facing away. Then I'm going to pull off my cardboard on the bottom, and I'm going to pull out all of the newspaper. Now, technically, you could leave this newspaper in and it would fire out in the kiln, which is perfectly fine. You can leave paper inside of clay during a firing. In fact, there are times where that's the best bet. The problem with our pieces is we built them so thick and sturdy that it is highly likely we're going to have areas where it's so thick that it's holding onto water and will then crack or shatter in the kiln, even if we do a full slow firing. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to carve away and even out this interior surface here. For that, I'm going to use this large loop tool. If you cannot get the neck out, you can use a pair of pliers and kind of pull from different directions. You're shooting for a thickness about like your thumb, because you don't want to get too thin in the shoulders or it's going to collapse under the weight of that head. So about that thick all the way around. When you get to areas like here where it's a little thinner, I'll use some of that clay I just carved out to fill in the gaps so that it's even and strong. And if a little bit of that paper and newspaper stays in your clay, it really is not an issue. So don't stress about getting every little scrap of paper off. Work more towards a pretty even thickness and strong construction. To tell how thick it is as you move up the shoulders, what you're going to do is kind of pinch your fingers together. And when you pinch the fingers together, you can kind of feel that thickness. So I can feel that it's way too thick here. I need to thin it out. Up here, it's rather thin. I'll probably add a little bit of clay. So I just kind of get a sense of how thick everything is. And then I'll go work on a section, both cutting away and adding if needed, trying to get it about the same thickness all the way through. As you continue to slowly carve away and get even thickness, make sure you're checking often to see how thick that piece is. Fill in where there's gaps and then compress the clay in the spaces that you have completed. That compression will help to strengthen the clay structure and avoid cracks happening in the drying and the firing time. On a side note, you could also build these busts solid, so no newspaper in the middle, just solid clay that you'd carve out in the same way that we're doing here. That's two different ways to make large clay sculptures, with the newspaper base and a solid build, but both involve some hollowing in the end. At this point, I've evened everything out. I've compressed the clay by smoothing it. I've added clay where it's thin. I've carved up into the neck as far as I can. And then I'm going to grab my needle tool and I'm going to use that to go in and poke holes all over this. The purpose of the holes is to increase the surface area to allow for more precise drying, and also to allow any massive air pockets in here to be opened up to reduce the risk of cracking in the firing process. You're going to put a lot of holes into your piece. So take your time, make sure you fill in that space as much as possible, and don't worry if the holes accidentally go through to the front. My last step then is I'm going to go in and just clean off this bottom edge. To finish off the bottom of this piece, obviously this doesn't look very nice if you were to flip this over and look at this piece from underneath. A nice finishing touch that I do not require my students to do, but they're welcome to do, is to roll a slab of clay and slip and score it onto the bottom of the piece, which kind of caps off this view. And then you can just poke, you know, 2 small holes into that slab, which then will give you a nice clean surface on the bottom of the piece, but still allowing air to flow through. At this point, you're gonna pick this baby back up and you're gonna pop it back onto your clay board, ideally on top, ideally on top of a paper towel, and then we'll go to the next step. For our next step in this process, we need to cut the head open and start to carve out the head itself. And this makes students nervous because they're always worried they're gonna mess up the hair, which is why I said when we put the hair on, we don't try to make it perfect yet. What we're going to do is cut a line with the hairline on the forehead and then around the top, kind of like we're cutting off the top of a jack-o'-lantern. So for this step, I start off with this tool, looks like an arrowhead on the end, and I define the line that I want to use to cut off the top of the head. So along the hairline, and then when I get above the eyebrows, I'm gonna go straight back over the ears. I don't wanna cut through the ears, around the back of the head, up and over the ear again, and then meeting up with the hairline in the front. Once I define the line, I'm going to go as deep as I can with this arrowhead tool, but sometimes with as thick as the head is, that arrowhead tool does not go deep enough. So I will grab, you could use just a kitchen knife, like a table knife. In the classroom, I have some longer clay knives that you can use, and you're just going to keep going around until that head lifts off pretty easily. It'll take a few passes and some effort to get through this clay. Take your time with it. You will encounter some resistance as you go around because you've got that newspaper on the inside. You've got thick, heavy clay around the outside. So you're gonna have to muscle it a little bit. If you lift off the top of the head and look, you can see how thick that clay is. So we're going to follow the same process on the inside of the head that we did on the bottom of the neck. I'm going to take the cranium, this top part of the head, and I'm going to place it somewhere like on top of some plastic bags that make a little nest for it so I don't mush it too badly while I work on the other parts of my piece. And if you look in here, you can see how thick that clay mass is, and that's what we're going to have to thin out. It's super important in this step that as you start to carve away, you're checking the thickness often. You don't accidentally want to carve through your eyeballs or your ears. If you look down at what I have so far, I've really narrowed out the upper part of the head, the back of the head, and the hair. I haven't done much with the face. You want to be really careful with the face. Usually the area where our eyes are pretty thin, so I'm not going to touch that. I'm feeling the thickness here, and it's about that thick, so I don't want to thin that out anymore. I could add a little clay on the back side of it, but I definitely don't want to take it away. I check my cheeks. Sometimes the cheeks are a little heavy. This one is, so I'm going to carve right here. Just get out a little bit of that clay. Sometimes we have quite a bit of clay in the chin, so I'm going to carve that out as well. And on the bottom of the neck, depending on your piece, it might be rather thin or it might be rather thick. It all depends on how that head shape started off. Now, if you accidentally get it too thin, you just add clay back in. If you accidentally cut through, again, you add clay back in. And I always use the clay I carve out because it's the same stiffness as the clay that's here. So it's going to attach better than really wet clay, and it's going to fill those spaces better for you. When I compress the clay in the head, I'm going to be really careful by my eyes not to mush my eyes. I'm not going to worry so much about compressing that a lot. I'll just smooth it out a little bit. So I don't want to mess up all the work I did on the front of my face. Remember that this compression step is important. Don't skip it, just be careful for the eyes. Here I've cut through, you can see some light through where the hair's coming in, so I'm going to take some of my extra clay and fill in that space. Don't stress if you cut through. Everything is fixable if you're willing to take the time and contemplate how to go about it. Just make sure that you get a nice even thickness. I'm going to come in with my needle tool again and poke holes.
Don't skimp on this step. We need all that surface area to help dry this more quickly and evenly.
At this point, I would do the same procedure with the top of the head. So I'm going to get that thinned out. Once that's thinned out, I'll show you how to put it back on.
Put it back together. We're going to score each edge on the head and on the cranium. Then we're going to add slip, and then we're going to score again to really work that slip into both of those edges. Once that's done, we're going to push it back together.
Once everything is slipped and scored really well, I'm going to pop that top back on the head. And what you'll notice is there'll be areas where it doesn't quite match up, and you might have to flex things to fit again a little bit.
Push those two seams together. You don't want gaps. Use some pressure here.
At this point, I'm going to roll a coil of some softer clay, and I'm going to patch that crack. I don't want a huge coil.
Make sure you really push that coil into the seam that you've made here. If you were a little stingy on the slip, now is a great time to add a little more underneath that coil.
And now what I'm going to go do is blend that coil back in, and pretty soon you won't even be able to tell where the seam was.
I'm simply using the wooden end of one of my clay tools to kind of brush the coil up and down into the hair, so having it flow with the same hair structure. On the forehead, I blend it in and then I smooth it out. It really quickly blends right into the hair.
At this point, you really can't see the seam where the bust was cut open, and you are now ready to add details to the rest of your piece. So it's at this point that I would go in and I would refine my hair and I would start adding small details. If when you're poking through the bust on the inside with that needle tool, if the needle tool pops out through things like the face, and I'm not seeing any examples of that on my piece, you simply just take your finger, and if you go like this, it'll close up those little gaps so that you don't have to worry about those things. For final details on hair at this point, because we kept it kind of loose until we got that piece cut open and thinned out. So final details on the hair, I typically use a loop tool like this, and I'll start to come in and I'll start to define edges a little bit more. I often get rid of some of the more chunky nature of things. I'll thin out where hair would end a little bit, but this is my tool of choice to kind of finalize and finish up the hair. If you're adding any more material to shoulders or face where it's gotten a little bit more stiff, you're really going to want to make sure that you slip and score really, really well to that drier clay. Otherwise, that wet new clay is not going to want to stick to it as much. So slipping and scoring at this point is going to be extra, extra key. And just take your time, have some fun, and do some funky fun things with your piece. Make it your own. Don't be afraid to be original. Don't be afraid to try out some new things.
So I'm just going to keep going into my hair, going in with that loop tool, continuing to add texture and refine it. When I'm done with that, I'm going to add details to this piece to kind of make it my own. It's going to be a little different and a little surreal, and I'd love to show you what it looks like. Here it is. So I added a nest to the top of the hair, and on the bottom I had the hair kind of morph into these cherry blossom branches, and the nest on the top with 3 eggs. The nest blends in with the hair as it moves down, and then I have the mama bird sitting on the shoulder here, and I'm not quite done with her yet. I'm still working on details. And you can just see that I've tried to add texture and details all the way around. There's more flowers on the back shoulder because the back should be as interesting as the front. And just really trying to finish the piece all the way around. I've also taken the time to clean up the bottom edge where it meets the table. Enjoy, have some fun, and really make this your own, my friends.